Welcome to Protecting Your Assets, the show about protecting people, property, and most importantly, protecting your ass. I'm your host, Lucky Luciano, and I'd like you to join me for a fast-paced and often fiery discussion about security issues with my co-host, Brian the Angry Man Claman. Whether we're piercing the veil of security, talking your duty of care, or raving about the latest technology, we'll share our thoughts on the issues, the trends that are impacting security today and into the future. And now let's talk about protecting your assets. Hello and welcome to Protecting Your Assets. I'm your host, Lucky Luciano Cedrone, and with me, Brian the Angry Man Claman. We are on to episode 3 today. And we're going to be talking about partnerships, also known as You're Not In It Alone. Oh, sorry, it's not about you. It's not about you. And so we're going to talk about the importance and value of working with others to make sure that your property, your operations are kept secure in today's dynamic and rapidly changing world of risk. But before that, I'm going to go back to...
I have a question. It's
What's
not
that?
about you or it's partnerships. What are we talking about?
It ain't about you either.
It's not about me. Okay, that's what you're saying. Okay, gotcha.
But in this case, I'm going to turn it over to you for some initial words. Say hello to the fans, the millions and millions of listeners.
Hello, fans. It's winters in Canada. I think last time we did the podcast, I talked about how nice the weather was. Going out in shorts, having the motorcycle out, going for rides. What a difference a couple of days make. I feel like we're in Antarctica. It is just friggin' cold out there. Walking the dogs, they're not getting their 1 hour walk, but I am away from the house for an hour. So my wife thinks we're walking. I take the car keys, I put the dogs in the car, and we just sit, listen to music in the heat. Do not like the winter.
Yeah, no kidding.
Don't tell my wife.
And the big storm coming this tonight, supposedly, right? Probably going to hit you more than it hits me.
Why is that? I pay my taxes.
Because you're in the middle of nowhere. I'm in civilization. We got a warm vertex here or whatever.
Well, there was quite that dump the other day in Buffalo, like it was 300 feet or something in 6 minutes. It's amazing.
Buffalo.
It's amazing though the difference. It's just like an hour away, but the south side of the lake versus the north side of the lake. I think actually the weather was so bad and actually dangerous in Buffalo. I think that has a lot to do with Biden, because I suspect if Trump was in power, we would not have seen this kind of a storm. It's certainly not this kind of a lethargic response from a Democratic left woke leaning government.
Trump would have just told the weather to just piss off and go somewhere else.
And he would have had wonderful love letters with the weather.
All right, let's keep moving. We want to move on to our traditional segment now in the new season, which is the good, the bad, and the ugly. You want to start off this week, or you want it to come to me?
Why don't we go with you?
Oh,
Be light for a change.
It's the new and improved sensitive.
Not really, but
all right, well, listen, I'll go through the 3 in a row for me. The good, I think, is that, we don't have a nuclear winter yet. No one's pushed the button, despite all the stuff that's going on in Ukraine. So that's a good thing. I think the bad is this whole FTX disaster in the cryptocurrency world. The little scumbag seems to have stolen a ton of the money before it all crashed and burned. But the interesting thing is now, and I don't know if you caught it today, Mr. Claman, but the interesting thing is that not only is he being sued, but there's a lawsuit being filed against everyone who basically helped them market the idea. So you've got Tom Brady and lots of other famous actors and athletes now who are being brought into the lawsuit for basically false advertising or whatever you want to call it. So I think that's going to be interesting. And if they're successful, what kind of precedents does that set going forward for all these other products that, maybe they're not, there might not even be sort of a malice involved, but you honestly say aspirin's a great product, and then all of a sudden they find aspirin's got a problem and you get dragged into that. I mean, that could really change the world of marketing.
The only defense I could think, especially for the celebrity spokespersons, is if they're going to have to demonstrate that they did some sort of due diligence, other than the fact that the due diligence included that the check that they were going to receive for $1 million is not going to bounce. think it has to be a little bit more than that. And I think it might be a good thing, because if you look at, especially in the States with the alternate reality hosts like Alex Jones and all these guys, and especially Alex Jones, he has sort of a e-commerce business that he promotes on the side, and apparently that's where he makes his money. And all these claims that if you take this potion or you take this pill, you'll live forever or you'll survive a nuclear war, and people believe him because he's a personality. I think maybe it will be good if it sets some precedent. We'll see.
He's definitely one of the guys on the fringes, but when you talk about people like Kevin O'Leary's named in this as well, right? He's a well-known Canadian businessman. Yeah. So, these are people who do their due diligence. They do take extra, you would think they know the business, and they were, hoodwinked into it. Actually, the guy who, and I can't remember, I was reading it this morning, but the person, I think it's an auditor that was looking into the papers for the US, and he's had a history of, like, he investigated, not Nortel, but WorldCom when they collapsed. And he said he's never seen such a complete failure of checks and balances in a financial paper, like documentation, as he's seen with FTX. So that's my bad. And then the ugly, I think, was watching Donald Trump announce the worst kept secret in the world, and that he actually finally announced that he's running for the presidency in 2024. Everyone knew he was going to announce it at some point, but I thought, my God, it was just an ugly all around event. He looked terrible. He sounded terrible. And I don't think he's got the traction he had 4 years ago.
He actually did look terrible. I remember watching that, telling my wife, even his breathing.
Yeah.
It looked like he was going to have a heart attack, like he was gasping for breath. There wasn't that energy that we saw the first time around. But yeah, I would agree. So the Donald Trump thing, is that the ugly? How do you classify it?
The way it happened was ugly. It was, I almost felt sorry for the guy, because it's sort of like a clamoring for attention, that little kid tugging at your shirt saying, I'm still here, guys. I'm still here.
I guess, yeah, it's pretty pathetic.
Anyway, over to you.
Okay, so the good, bad, the ugly, from my perspective. The good is the work the RCMP did last week with that Chinese espionage case out of Hydro-Quebec.
Today, the RCMP is announcing the arrest of Yushang Wang, age 35, from Candiac. Mr. Wang was charged with espionage for obtaining trade secrets in the course of his duties with Hydro-Quebec. This is the first time this charge has been laid in Canada. It is alleged that he obtained this information to benefit the People's Republic of China, to the detriment of Canada's economic interests.
That's a great example, I believe. I don't know the facts yet, but typically on these type of cases, knowledgeable insider type cases, it's indicative to me that the corporate security people in Hydro-Quebec, the compliance people in Hydro-Quebec, had a good view of what was happening internally, saw some red flags that concerned them, and notified the police, and the police, the RCMP, did a wonderful job. So that's the good. That's where a great example where security and partnerships actually work well.
Yeah.
The ugly is the litigation that's following now with Alex Baldwin with the shooting on that film set last year. And everyone is getting dragged into that. It's a ugly situation where it shows that when you don't have proper controls, health and safety, oversight and compliance, when things go wrong, everyone gets thrown into the sewer.
I don't understand why on a film set you need live ammunition. I just don't get it.
I don't either. Like, I mean, I have fired live rounds. I've fired blanks, if you will, type thing. And in terms of the effect, it's almost the same. So I don't get it. And especially my understanding with that one, and that's going to be really ugly. The armorer was just a young person that didn't have a lot of experience. And a lot of the Hollywood armorers like have 20, 30, 40 years of experience and they're consummate experts. This person really wasn't that. So that's going to be ugly. Yeah. And the bad is the World Cup situation with Budweiser. My understanding is they have, I think, paid almost $150 million in sponsorship. And again, I don't know all the facts, but I think that's a classic example of why it's important to do your due diligence. And I'm just thinking out loud that if I was a brewery, a alcohol company, one of the largest in the world, if I'd be putting $150 million of advertising, into an event like the World Cup, which is good, in an Islamic country. Like, what do you think? Is there a possibility there could be a problem? I think that's a bad miss on someone's part.
Well, I think as we were talking before we went live here, you don't understand the world of soccer as I do, but you do know that FIFA is probably the most corrupt organization out there. The IOC probably gives them a run for their money, but historically, those sponsors get exclusive rights to the games, and that's the big payoff. Now, for whatever reason, I guess FIFA and Budweiser thought that the Middle East was going to cater to them, sort of like, and to be honest, like in Brazil, they have such power that they can come into a country and tell you when you're going to sell those alcohol, like when they'll change the time for alcohol sales. They'll change where you can do it, right? The areas that you can sell. So that's the kind of leverage that they've had historically. So I think this has been a real, in my opinion, a pleasant ass kicking from people who have a lot more money than they don't need FIFA there, and they're pulling, to your point, this is our religion. You knew coming in here, this is what we're going to do. So too bad.
And that's my point. That sort of goes to the greed factor type thing. I understand why Budweiser wants to be there, but I don't think anyone could be surprised that it's unfolding at the last minute. It's not a surprise to me. And you're right. I'm not a big soccer guy like you, sir. I bow to you. However, take soccer out of it. You put $150 million and you're an alcohol company and you want to get exposure and you're going to a country where alcohol is taboo. Yep. It's not a big surprise that you may have challenges. And I'm just surprised that a company like Budweiser didn't really have a contingency, didn't see this as a possibility. Anyways, it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that, alcohol, quite frankly, who cares? I'm drinking now, but I don't need to drink to watch a game.
I'm not sure about you don't need to drink because we just traveled together.
It's not a game changer for me, but I think it could get even uglier because when you talk about, their beliefs and their enforcement of, against gays in particular, they've made it clear that if you're caught having sex with anyone but your spouse, that you could face significant fines or even imprisonment. So that to me is even more concerning. Like if they start taking that type of action, boy, oh boy, it's going to be a truly ugly World Cup.
Well, on the Budweiser theme, years ago, I worked for a large American financial services company, one of the largest in the world, and they had a lot of international operations. And one of the things the global security team would do, and I was part of that team, is whenever we had a special event or any business dealings anywhere in the world, we would do the pre-work to look at where are we going, what are the cultural sensitivities, and then we compare that with looking what are we planning to do and what are the problematic points that are going to occur. I would like to think, and I'm pretty certain Budweiser did that, would have understood that, should have seen this coming, but something went wrong, and it's going to be interesting to see. And your point about the sex or relationships, it well taken, unless it's your spouse. Yeah. And only if your spouse is the opposite sex. Because if your spouse is the same sex, that's going to be also
a problem.
Yeah,
and it's a direct shot at the prostitution that goes around with these types of tournaments and all those lovely things, right? Drugs and things that people may think doesn't happen.
Well, and I just want to say this: it's an international event, okay, and you've got to be respectful of people's cultures. But we also have to realize it's an international event, and the World Cup is not just about that culture. Yeah. And if the organizing committee wasn't comfortable that there would have been tolerance and acceptance of everyone's culture, their culture, the Western culture, they should not have been selected.
So that segues nicely because it's not just about them and it's not just about you. It's about partnerships and working with others to make everything a success. So we are going to be talking about partnerships today. We have talked about it in the past, but today we're going to do a refresh on that because Brian wanted to, quite frankly. So,
and I'm the sponsor, so there you go. See, I don't mess up like Budweiser. I put my money where I have control.
Yeah, and I can't push anything. I got no money to push back anyway. So. All right, so let's get into it. what is the partnership for you, Brian? Why is it so important to create them and make sure that your security program considers establishing those partnerships with?
Well,
the
you know, you sort of said it at the segue. It's not about you. Like, you can't do it alone. And partnerships create what I call a force multiplier effect. Two people are stronger than one person, and three people are stronger than two people, and so on and so on. And that's why you do partnerships. When I talk about partnerships, so I'm talking about strategic partnerships. So when it comes to the security world, be it security guards, corporate security, financial services security, it's really who's in it together, okay? Who has an interest? So when I was in the financial services world, we were doing a lot
You
of,
seriously checking your phone on air?
well, I'm expecting a call from President Biden, wanted to talk about a partnership we're trying to work out. And, it could have been important. It could have been my wife saying, bring home a bread, okay? So
Yes, that would be important.
So if we use the example of the financial services industry, okay, and white collar crime, there's only so much the bank investigators or the credit card investigators can do. They rely on the enforcement people, which is law enforcement, in order to do their job properly. Law enforcement also rely on the front line, the eyes and ears. Great example of partnership. We talked about that in the good, bad, ugly segment when I talked about good, is the work the RCMP did last week in Hydro-Quebec in Quebec with that espionage case. Again, I don't know the facts yet, but based on my previous lives and experiences, I am certain there was pre-established partnerships between the security folks and compliance folks at Hydro, the government of Quebec, and the RCMP before this happened, so that when it did happen, they were able to move in and work collaboratively, creating a force multiplier effect. And I'm going to go into that in a second. But the other thing is, if you recall, you and I and others during the G20 in downtown Toronto in the financial district, I could not keep everyone safe by myself, nor could you. But if I could work with you in Oxford and Cadillac Fairview and all the other stakeholders, the key real estate managers down there, in concert with CSIS and the RCMP and the Toronto Police, and if we all worked together and we all had something to contribute, it would make the task a lot simpler. So that's why partnerships are important. You can't do it alone, and it creates that force multiplier effect.
Well, I think I'll make two comments. First of all, I don't think a lot of security practitioners are really aware of the tools that are out there. And I continue to deal with clients in my full-time job, and I can tell you that there's still people out there, and I'm not just saying security managers, but even clients, like property managers and things like that, who have no clue or no visibility to what is available to them because they're so focused on their four corners that's the extent of their outreach, right? So when I go in there and I say, do you talk to your neighbor across the street? Do you know who the security program is? Do they have a security program at the building across the street? Oftentimes, they don't have a clue, and then take it to the next level and I say, well, have you reached out to the local police authority? They have dedicated officers to engage with businesses to help you share information, intel, bring up resources in. If they've done, with proper time and planning, the police will, do what they can to support you. And we've done those in the past, exercises and things like that, right? Yeah. That's one. And then the other thing is, now you cut me off. So I thought you were going to cut me off.
I was not to, but I promised, so I'll wait.
So first one was the tools. They don't know they're there. And then, so the second point I wanted to make was some people, and I think we both experienced these people, because you used to be one of them, to be honest. Some people have it in their head that we can't share the information. We got to keep it, nice and tight, to need to know basis, just for us, select people. There's certain industries that I think you're familiar with that when I say, they're not very, what's the word? Forward coming with information. They look down upon us, and you remember the property owners, right? We were always looked down upon as like second tier, and you don't really have the expertise. And meanwhile, CSIS is the one saying, well, actually, those guys are the ones who own the building that's bringing these meetings. So that, I think, is another challenge, not knowing that the tools are there, and then not having the right people in the positions to appreciate the reality that you need to be connected, you need to share information with the right stakeholders.
Well, yeah, and I think you disparaged, I feel a bit like Donald Trump here. You disparaged my reputation there with the inference that I would, or the insinuation that I was one of those. I would, what I was that you got to keep it close to your heart, close to your chest. You don't disclose widely. What you said was an oxymoron. You said that you don't share, and then you said need to know. That's exactly the point. You share prescriptively with the need
Yes.
to know. And that's the important thing with partnerships is establishing the parameters of what gets shared and who needs to know it
Yep.
and who doesn't need to know it. Another example, based on what you were saying, you know, I talked about Hydro-Quebec and I talked about what I perceive the relationship with their investigators, compliance people, law enforcement, and CSIS, and that's sort of at one tier of the security spectrum. Many of our listeners are also on that other tier, that physical security tier, where with security guards. And a case in point is trespass to property. And it amazes me how many times people say, yeah, you know, people are trespassing all the time. There's nothing we could do about it. And the police won't do anything about it. It's just a $58 ticket. And I'm really proud of the work that I did with you and other senior security people down the financial district, that with the high rollers, with the people that were trespassing on a regular basis, we sat down with their strategic partners of 52 Division. We said, here's a problem. And this is why it's a problem for us. And we would put it out on the table. And this is why it's a problem for you, because you got to keep sending officers to do the same thing and nothing is happening. So through the partnerships, we got in front of the Crown Attorney and we were able to start getting jail time for these chronic offenders of TPA. So it was no longer just a $58 ticket. They're going to wait for 3 months, 4 months. One guy got 6 months in jail because his trespass activity was so egregious and it was documented. We were able to do something about it. Had those partnerships not been in place, it would have been a revolving door and nothing would have happened. That's a real simple example of the effectiveness of partnerships.
This is the new and improved Mr. Claman. You're short and concise. I like it. It's, I don't know, maybe it's the alcohol that's just affecting me, but it's good to see.
No, it's just that there's so much abuse I could take. You know, you're like Lucky Luciano, the happy-go-lucky guy on air. But I have to deal with you off air, and it's a whole different thing. It's a whole different persona. And quite honestly, I'm grayer now since we started this. And
all right, listen. Okay, let's move on. Keep it going. I think the next part is talking about how we make sure that they succeed, that they're successful programs. And I know that you know, you're a big believer in establishing those relationships early, not when it's D-Day and you know, the barbarians are at the gate, so to speak. And I would agree with that. I don't think there's anybody that should disagree with you. But share with us some of your experiences in making sure that those partnerships have been successful, and some of the challenges that you need to overcome.
well, for starters, I've been very fortunate to be involved in some very, very successful partnerships, some that have been acknowledged as some of the best ones nationally and potentially even internationally. And not just me, but with a lot of colleagues such as yourself and David Salston and a whole bunch of other people. Okay, so I'll just start with that. But you know, why do some partnerships work and many partnerships don't work? Well, I'll tell you why. That it's like an arranged marriage versus a marriage that blossoms normally. Partnerships can't be mandated. It can't be the senior vice president of security for the organization and the chief of police in Toronto telling each of their subordinates, you got to play together and you got to work together. That's often what the case is. You know, the president of an organization or the Canadian Bankers Association, and maybe the premier or some cabinet minister looking at criminal activity happening, saying we've got to work together. You do need that corporate sponsorship. That's true. But before you sit down and become partners and work on committees and joint programs, it starts very simply. It starts, and I have a good graphic, which if we could find it, we'll put it up in a second. It's really a group of guys. What is the first step? Is a group of guys sitting around a table at an Irish pub drinking Guinness. That's the essential element of a partnership. And I actually made that statement at a presentation I made several years ago in Ottawa at the Canadian Police College. And basically, the point I was trying to make is that you got to start off as friends, because we talked about the exchange of information and need to know. people don't want to share with people they don't trust, and people typically don't trust people that they don't like. So I often say the first essential element is friends. You got to get to know these people. You got to get together, professionally, socially. You don't have to go bowling with them. I'm not saying that, but you got to get to know them, because our friend Bill Needles, retired Superintendent Needles, says, and he stole that from me, I'm sure, that the time to exchange the business card is not during the emergency. It's got to be weeks and months and years before, when you have a chance to build that trust in that relationship. To me, that is the key. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. You don't want to be waiting to the last minute. The only thing I would add for the listeners, certainly like the business owners who don't have a lot of exposure to police in particular, is that there always seems to be a hesitancy to reach out to some of these groups, especially the police, because they've got this perception of, they're too busy or they don't care. And I would encourage them to reach out if that's their hesitancy. I think it's misplaced, because, yeah, we're both ex-coppers. But every time I've reached out to the police services, or when I've asked others to do the same for support and build that relationship, to your point, ask them out for a coffee, bring them over to the property, do a tour, introduce them to your team. They're often and most likely, very appreciative of the opportunity, first of all, to come to the buildings and see what they ultimately are responsible for if something goes wrong. So it's nice to be able to do that. And they are desperate for private sector partners, right? Oftentimes we don't reach out because we're intimidated, whatever the reason is. So I would encourage our listeners who are business owners thinking about it, reach out to your local police representative. They have the resources there. Yeah, they may not be there 24/7. They've got other things to do. But the day comes when you need them, to have that name already in your Rolodex to sort of age ourselves, is critical, because you make that phone call and they say, yeah, you know what, I know Joe over at property ABC. He's not going to call me because it's some chicken shit thing. It's probably something serious. We've had these discussions. I know where his head's at, so I better respond to that. And they will organize the resources to get you the help you need, or at least give you the advice to steer in the right direction.
Well, I agree. There is a second key element, though. You start off with friendships and mutual respect, but partnerships are not going to work unless there's something in it for both parties.
Yep.
Because otherwise it's not partnership, it's a charity. So both parties have to get something fundamentally out of the relationship. And what you were, the example, like when I was doing financial crime, financial services crime, what it was is that what law enforcement gave to us is they had powers of warrants, search warrants, they had arrest powers that we don't have. What was in it for them is we had expertise and access to stuff that they don't have. So any partnership, irrespective of what it is, okay, it's not going to work unless you can clearly, at least in your own mind, articulate, this is what's in it for me, what's in it for the other partners. And if you can't articulate that equally, then maybe the ones that there's nothing in it for you from them, maybe shouldn't be there. And to bring it back to the disparaging remarks you said about me earlier that I don't want to share, that was predicated on the fact that those people that you were trying to bring in didn't have anything in it for me. And if you take care of all the individual needs of the team, of the partners, that's the force multiplier effect. So your apology, whenever you're comfortable, will be accepted up till
I'm going to take that cue to move into our final section, cognizant of the time, to talk about some of the successful partnerships that we've both been a part of. And in particular, the one I'm referencing, and I'm sure you're referencing, is the creation of PathCom in the downtown financial district, which, to those who aren't familiar with PathCom, it is a privately funded, fully encrypted emergency communication channel that links about 35 properties in the downtown core, mostly 52 division. And that, for those who aren't familiar with 52 division, it's basically all the key properties or entertainment locations in Toronto: the Rogers Centre, the CN Tower, the Financial District, the Eaton Centre. All these key properties, pretty much all of them are on PathCom. And when we were thinking of creating PathCom, the argument was from my good friend, Mr. Claman, that we should just restrict it to the four corners of the financial district. And I, through some leveraging and painful education, finally dragged them out of the gutter into the enlightened world of sharing with other people and bringing them into the circle of trust so that we, basically my argument was, if all you do, if your partnership is only 4 people at 4 corners, that's the only visibility you have. Let's talk to the people at the south end of the city. Let's talk to the people at the north end of the city, because the further out we get intelligence, the more time we have to prepare. And that was the argument. You finally came over to the good side, you bought in, and that's the argument.
Shame. I bought in when you were able to demonstrate to me how it was beneficial to the 4 corners. So that's exactly my point, though. It's not just about being the biggest and the greatest, but if each person if it's not mutually beneficial to the partners, it's not going to work. And you did at the end, because I forced you to do it because you needed me. When you were able to demonstrate how it was beneficial to my corner of King and Bay Street, then it made sense. But we did have discussions, and TAPS, by the way, Toronto Association of Police and Private Security is another one, which predates PATHCOM. And there were a lot of discussions at one point with senior police leadership in Toronto about bringing in the whole city and different elements. And it was a security information sharing group with the police intelligence. And one of the, I was against it, and I was able to prevail and convince others that the bigger you get, the more difficult it is to share information, because you lose that trusted partnership. The need to know becomes one more of just curiosity than operational need. So we were able to keep it scaled down. One thing I want to say about PATHCOM, which you were the chairman, and you were one of the founding members along with several others. It was not only an interoperable radio and communication network with the private sector, but it was one of the first of its kind, at least at the time in Canada, if not North America, where the radio system was integrated with Toronto 911,
That's right.
police, fire, and ambulance. And that's what made it unique. Other places and other cities had security groups in the different venues able to talk to each other. But we realized in order to have the force multiplier effect, and it saved our bacon during G20, we had to have emergency service tied in, all 3 levels of emergency service, police, fire, EMS. And that was a Herculean accomplishment that we made, but it was because of the pre-established partnerships that started as friendships over beer and trust that followed that allowed us to do it. And quite honestly, the partners on the emergency services side did a lot of the heavy lifting because they believed in the vision, and they were able to sell it internally that this is how it's going to help us. And they're able to say us first, and also it's going to help them. And we shamelessly did the same thing to our bosses. This is how it's going to help the private sector. And by the way, emergency services. So that's a great example of.
Although I will say that, as you're aware, it is, especially when it's a volunteer organization, which that was, none of us were getting paid to do it. We were doing it because we thought it was the right thing to do. But even then, as something as obvious as I think, and certainly you thought that PATHCOM was, or TAPS was, there's Safe Group, there's a bunch of security groups that existed in the downtown core that were successful to various degrees. But one of the ongoing challenges was always, it was like herding cats. There was always, the guys on the fringes who were basically along for the ride, and they weren't really pulling their weight, for lack of a better word or a term. And that is always the challenge, because if too many of those guys come on board, to your point, they start to devalue the vision, and people start to look around, right? Like, why am I putting all this effort into a program when Joe and John, they ain't doing crap and they're getting all the benefits? It starts to fall apart. And I think that that's actually happened with a lot of the organizations where they've just fallen off the radar because the leadership hasn't been there. It's gone away and no one's filled the void.
Well, I call it succession planning, and you're right. I think, when we were on the scene, if you will, I think we had some really effective partnerships that people all over were looking at. Like, again, going back to PATHCOM for a second, people in Calgary were so impressed that we were invited to go down, and we made a presentation to the city of Calgary, police, fire, and ambulance, the security community, and they now have a very vibrant PATHCOM program. City of Montreal also had interest in, and that's what started with us in Toronto. So I think, though, a lot of the things has sort of slipped back, as you sort of suggested. TAFs isn't what it was. TAFs doesn't exist anymore. TAFs, by the way, for people to understand, was a private sector initiative. Nick Migliori was one of the founders of it. He was a chair for many, many years. And TAFs was a information sharing between law enforcement and the private security community in Toronto. And it was a world-class program. In fact, years ago, it won the International Association of Chiefs of Police Ed Shanahan Award for perfection or excellence in private-public partnerships. And just to understand the importance of that award, this was privately funded, private sector run. The police were involved, but on the outside, it was really run by the private sector, funded by the private sector. The year after we won it, NYPD Shield, okay, which was formed after 9/11, which was a New York Police Department initiative with the police department and the private security community in New York to share information, just like TAF. So we won it, they won it, but they are funded by Department of Homeland Security to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars. So it shows you the power of what individuals that are passionate could do. Now, the longevity, okay, is the concern. And the reason I don't think these things have survived the test of time is because of either a lack of effective succession planning, or the generation behind us having the same passion that we had. And, you know, it's regrettable. Another one that we were part of was the Commercial Real Estate Financial District Security Group, which was for the first time, certainly in this city, you had all the major bank towers, okay, which is the heart of Canada's financial critical infrastructure, a targeted entity. The international terrorist community, Islamic terrorist community, wanted to take out Bay and King. It was the senior security leaders of the different real estate management companies coming together and saying, this isn't about competition and we're going to make more money than you. When it comes to security and protection of lives and assets, there are no competitors. You know, we built that. It was fantastic. Through that, we got all sorts of accolades and invites to different CSIS and RCMP and FBI and police type things. It was really great. But over time, these things, unless you keep putting your blood and sweat into them, they tend to diminish. And again, I don't know the state of these things anymore. I suspect, though, I know TAPS doesn't exist, which is regrettable. And the others, I don't know how effective they are.
Well, I know Pathcom still does their Wednesday radio checks, and they've tried to do some exercise. So it's still up functioning and operating. I've heard it, so I know it exists. But as you said, longevity, and we are past our time. So
past our prime, best before date.
Let's move on to the closing stages. Just to let everyone know that we are going to have our first guest of season 3 on our next podcast. And we expect to anyway, unless things change. But Brian, a quick intro, just a heads up on who we're having.
Yeah, many of you may know her, Sergeant Wendy Drummond with Toronto Police Service. She has been a long time, very public face of the Toronto Police Service. She was for the longest time the media spokesperson, and when something bad would happen in Toronto, she'd be the person in front of the cameras. She then spent time, and she was really good, and that's where we met Wendy through the partnerships when we were downtown. And then she moved into recruiting and bringing new blood and talent into Toronto Police Service. And now she's in charge of the Toronto Police Auxiliary Program and also their crime prevention initiatives. And I think Wendy's going to talk to us about what's happening in the city, talking about the auto thefts, the carjackings that are occurring. And we're going to try, Luke and I, to spin it into the partnership between the police and security to deal with these things, to enhance crime prevention and livability in the city. So we're quite excited to have Wendy next session.
Yeah, so am I. And that'll be on December 15th, just before Christmas. This episode is going to be on December 1st, although we're taping it obviously well in advance of that. So we look forward to speaking with Wendy, and hopefully we can take some lessons away from it. And that our listeners can apply to their daily operations. But until then, as always, stay safe. What?
You usually say closing remarks. I'll keep it short. I just want to say, to tie up the session, about partnerships, really, the sky is the limit. And I just encourage the listeners, be them security folks or non-security business leaders, look at where you have common interest, okay? Identify who are the stakeholders of the common interest within the private sector, outside into the public sector. And I encourage you, make a phone call, get together over a coffee, introduce yourself, start there. It's not difficult. Start there, meet regularly, share concerns, get to know each other, and see where it goes. Because far too often, like Luke said, I see this in my practice all the time, talk with clients, they're frustrated about things, but they never thought for a second that they could A, go to their competitor, or B, to the public sector and talk about it and get to know who the people are. I even ask, who's the local police commander or your competitor? Who is your competitor? Who's doing what you're doing? And they don't know. Get off your chair, pick up the phone, take out your expense account, buy a coffee, get to know these people, get to like them, get to trust them, and you'll be amazed the things you can do.
Anyway, with that, thanks for tying it up. It's a good summary. A little lengthy, we are over time on this episode, but we will try and tighten it up going forward. And we look forward to speaking with Wendy in episode 4. And until then, stay safe, stay warm. The snowstorms are coming, so stay inside. No need to be on the roads if you don't have to. And we will see you in a couple of weeks.
There is no making you happy. I talk too fast. I talk too slow. Everyone be safe, stay warm. Have a good one.
All right. Bye-bye.
That concludes this podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening and will join us in a couple of weeks for our latest episode. Please remember to like and follow us on our sponsor's webpage, brianclaman.com, where you can leave us your comments and suggest topics you'd like to hear about in future episodes. Until next time, thanks for listening, and don't forget to protect your assets.